It's very good to be here. I want to thank both Lauren and Michael for the invitation and for IHE for hosting me today, for you all for showing up. I'm going to try to keep this fairly short and just touch on some aspects of what we refer to as the Sustainable Rivers Program. Sometimes I might abbreviate that as SRP. Just out of habit. So I'll talk a little bit about it, and again, want to really leave time for discussion. I'd love to hear about the work that you all do, and that's part of why I'm here as well, to learn more about the work of IHE, some of which I know through Michael and the exchanges and work that we've been doing together. So again, my name is Andrew Warner. I'm currently a senior program advisor and program manager for CDM Smith. CDM Smith is a firm that works on environmental projects, water infrastructure projects, and transportation. We have projects globally, about 4,000 employees around the world. I've got two other organizations noted up here, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Nature Conservancy. My former job, before I came to CDM Smith, I worked for 17 years with the Nature Conservancy's Global Freshwater Program. And through that work, I collaborated very closely and very often with groups like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other water resource management agencies around the world. And so this presentation of the Sustainable Rivers Program focuses really on this collaboration between the Corps of Engineers and the Nature Conservancy, and ultimately a number of other institutions as well, to advance environmental flow definitions and implementation through changes in core reservoir operations. Just a quick outline. I'll talk a little bit about background and context for the work. I think it's important to know a little bit about institutionally and sort of socially some of the context for the work. And then I'll kind of go through how the program was launched and how it's continued to evolve, and then touch on a few case studies very lightly. I want to try to just give an idea of what the work has entailed, but also just leave it open, so if you all are more interested in some of the policy side of things, or the engineering, or the ecological sciences, or the interactions of all of those, we can focus more on those through discussion. And then again, I'll close with sort of a look forward. We do have a paper that was published in 2014, and a number of aspects that I'll be touching on are summarized in that paper for anybody who might want to look into that. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, there's maybe a couple of takeaway points that I'd like to highlight with this slide. First of all, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is huge as a water management organization. It actually dates back to prior to when the country was formed. It dates back to the 1770s when George Washington was forming the Revolutionary Army to fight the British. And he had a small band of engineers, he called the Army Corps of Engineers, that supported those military operations. It's evolved over the centuries really to have a vast array of responsibilities. More than 700 dams that it owns and operates is really going to be the focus of the discussion today, but it deals with flood protection, navigation, hydropower generation. It's the largest single hydropower producer in the nation. Water supply, recreation is extremely important at the 700 dams, at many of the 700 dams. And then as a result of that, there's an estimation that these core reservoirs impact something in the order of about 80,000 river kilometers across the United States. So you can see in terms of the ecological sciences where the interest would come in being able to maybe influence how those dams are managed. This is maybe even a little bit of a broader context when you look across the United States. Water development has progressed to the point where there's only 1% of the major rivers in the U.S. that remain free-flowing. So again, from a conservation or environmental or ecological standpoint, if you want to benefit these ecosystems and the ecosystem services, you really have to find a way to constructively engage with dam operations. To give a little bit of a snapshot at the national level, this is a plot that shows on the y-axis some species groupings, birds, mammals. You can read them as they go up. Flowering plants all the way to the top, freshwater mussels, and then on the x-axis is the percentage of species in those species groupings that are at some level of imperilment within the United States. So flowering plants, for example, you can read over, and little more than a third of those, or about a third of those, are at some level of vulnerability or presumed extinct, all right, due to a whole range of activities. So is there anything that you all notice about this?
They're all aquatic ecosystem species at the top.
Yeah. So when you look at these top four groupings, freshwater fish, amphibians, crayfish, freshwater mussels, every single one of those is largely or completely dependent upon the health of the freshwater ecosystems. And so, there's a number of reasons you can get into as to why these species groupings are adversely impacted, why they're degraded to a greater percentage than some of these others. But if you look at advancements that have been made, improvements actually in water quality since the Clean Water Act in the United States was passed in the early 70s, water quality has actually improved considerably. And so there's other things that, of course, have gone on. Direct habitat destruction is an adverse impact, is a source of degradation, and the presence and operations of dams is a critical one, and the alterations of natural flow patterns. And so that really just is intended to highlight the importance of and the role that these dams and operations of the dams play in the health of these ecosystems. So really this was the foundation when we started with the Nature Conservancy, started to develop a relationship in the late 1990s with the Army Corps of Engineers, recognizing that the impact that they had on freshwater ecosystems was vast. In fact, I think it's probably, by any measure, the agency, the institution that has the single largest impact on freshwater ecosystems anywhere in the U.S. And so the idea is, behind the Sustainable Rivers program, it asks this basic question of, can we have the benefits of water infrastructure and at the same time either maintain or, in often cases in the U.S., restore the health of the river ecosystems and the services they provide? So that's the basic sort of premise that we have as underlying the Sustainable Rivers program and the collaboration between these two organizations and the dozens and dozens of organizations that have since become involved. So I'll get back to some of these sites through the talk, but I really wanted to focus on the Green River in Kentucky. It was really the launch point for the Sustainable Rivers program. Kentucky is in this sort of the eastern central portion of the United States. I think best known in the U.S. for horse country and horse racing with the Kentucky Derby, and of course whiskey. Our best whiskey is made in Kentucky. But for me, the Green River is also in Kentucky. And the Green River is, ecologically speaking, one of the richest river systems in the nation. I've watched scientists pull out of a 30 or 40 meter reach of river in about 30 minutes, 25 or 30 species of mussels, just like that. It's incredible. It really is intensely rich. 152 species of fish. It's connected to the Mammoth Cave Complex, which is a vast cave complex. And there's all sorts of species that are endemic to that cave system. And there's a physical connection between the river and the cave that's critically important to those species. Corps of Engineers built a dam called the Green River Dam in 1968, primarily for flood control, recreation, and water supply. So this was is a river that's very important to the Nature Conservancy as a conservation organization. So in 1998, we went into the Louisville District, which is the regional office of the Corps of Engineers that operates the Green River Dam and about 24 other dams across the region, and asked them if they had some operational flexibility, to which they responded, yes. What do you want us to do? And we didn't know, because we didn't expect that answer, frankly. So we said, well, that's great. Why don't we work on it together? Why don't we figure this out together? And that was really the launch of the Sustainable Rivers program. We didn't call it that at the time. At the time, it was really just focused on the green and trying to figure out what we could do with the Corps of Engineers as an institution that we hadn't really worked that closely with. And they didn't really know that much about us. So some of it was just kind of getting to know me stuff. And then it was about the science and how you could synthesize the science, bring that science into an engineering world in a constructive way, and articulate it in terms that could be useful for the water managers, for the engineers, the men and women who actually operate the dam. And so that was really, again, the launch of, it was sort of the precursor to the Sustainable Rivers program. When you look at the initial operations, this is sort of the cartoon version of how this work played out. This is sort of a schematic of the initial operations of the Green River Dam. You can see a couple of basic things. The winter pool, the reservoir levels maintain low for flood season. This is on a calendar year, January through December. So they maintain a lot of space in the reservoir, waiting for floods and helping to minimize the impact of flooding in the system. And then in the spring, typically March, April, May, they began filling the reservoir, and by about this time, actually by the end of May, they look to have it filled to summer pool, when recreation is really the key driver. This is a part of the country where this reservoir is extremely important economically. It's not a particularly wealthy part of the country, and this draws a huge number of recreational visitors for camping and boating and fishing. And so they really got to get up to that summer pool to support the recreation. And then they draw it down in the autumn, in September, October, November, through the latter part of the year. And there's a destratification, temperature destratification that occurs. Stratification occurs typically, again, right around now, right around early June. Destratification occurs later in the year as they're drawing down the reservoir. So that was the initial operations, and ecologically, we got a bunch of the ecologists together, and we said, well, okay, so what's going on here ecologically in the river system? And there were a few things that were of concern to the ecologists, and in particular, during these fall months, a natural low flow period for the Green River, these rich mussel populations that I was talking about, many of them are reproducing. All right, so they're releasing glaucidia that need to attach to host fish, and they stay attached to the host fish for months and months, depends on the species. But they rely on these low flow periods that bring the fish, these host fish, in close proximity to the mussels. All right, so these drawdowns were elevating flows much high above the natural low flow periods. And also, the releases were typically before destratification, so you're getting unusually cold water. So there were kind of two things that the reservoir was adversely impacting those ecological processes on. So we started to look at that in particular, as well as this period, but in particular the autumn months. And we were able to come up with, in working with the engineers, some pretty substantial changes, including giving up some of their winter pool, their flood protection storage. This was a system that was actually over-designed from the standpoint of flood protection. I can talk about why that was if we want to get into it. It was kind of a policy decision. But they were able to give up, so you see the winter pool going from 202.4 meters to 203.6 meters, and therefore they have less to fill and less to release. All right, there's less of a difference between the winter and summer pools. And then we also were able to get them to push a bulk of this fall drawdown beyond the time period at which most of the mussels were spawning, and beyond typically the destratification. So you had a shift, the destratification, and the temperature of the water became warmer. It didn't go to the natural temperature, but it became closer to that natural temperature. So through this, they've started to see, in the implementation, they actually changed the water control manual to incorporate these changes in operations, which was the first time, excuse me, the Corps of Engineers had ever changed the water control manual solely for environmental or ecological purposes. So that's great. But I kind of looked at that and said, well, that's fantastic. That's a data point of 1. They've got 700 dams around the nation. What we'd really like to do is to see the Corps of Engineers change how they operate dams everywhere, all 700 of them, so that they incorporate this kind of consideration into the operational design and the operation of their dams everywhere. It's like, well, they're not going to do that based on one positive experience at one point, one river, one district, one sort of social, economic, political context. So he said, okay, well, how about if we launch something that looks at more rivers, a subset of the 700, but something that captures a greater diversity of the ecological systems and the social and economic context in which these river systems exist. So we did. These are the original 8 Sustainable River Program sites, and you can see them around the country. They extend from New England, the Connecticut River System, the Roanoke, the Savannah, the Green, which was the original. We kept that in there. The White River System, the white, black, little red, kind of a combined system in the Mississippi drainage, Big Cypress Bayou. This is a Ramsar site. So a lot of ecological richness there. The Bill Williams River, this is an area of intense, it's a desert. We get about 20 to 25 centimeters of rain here a year. And then the Willamette River up in the Pacific Northwest. So these were the 8 original sites, and we said, let's try this kind of stuff everywhere and see how it goes. So that is the launch of the Sustainable Rivers Program, the SRP. So I'm going to say a little bit about the Savannah. It's where we went next. We realized that the Green River had some operational flexibility, so it was kind of low-hanging fruit. It was, relatively speaking, a simple place, so we wanted to go to the Savannah next because there's more complexity. So let me say just a little bit about the Savannah. Again, we went there next, and the Green River, we were able to, we sort of took an approach that probably could best be described as sort of an assumption of the natural flow paradigm. It was written by Roy Poff and Brian Richter and others that basically looked at the Green River and said, well, if we can make the river flow more like it did naturally, if you shift from where it is now, this modified condition, to a more natural, you'll have some benefit from that. Whereas with the Savannah, things are a little bit more challenging. There's a lot more demands on the river system, and so we needed to be more rigorous in the ecological articulation of the environmental flows. What are the justifications? What are the environmental flow requirements, and what are the ecological justifications? So we had to be a bit more rigorous, so we started to look at how we could capture that. The Savannah River, again, is in the southeastern United States, right along the border of the states of South Carolina and Georgia. I'm only capturing the lower river here. This is Thurmond Dam is up at the top. This is the city of Augusta, so there's a flood protection component. And then everything down here is largely undeveloped. There's an extensive bottomland hardwood forest, probably 7-8 kilometers wide in places that seasonally used to flood. There's bald cypress, and there's vast richness ecologically down through the system. And then you have an estuary system down at the coast. So we sort of looked around at work that other people were doing, people like Jackie King in South Africa, Angela Arthington in Australia, and others, looking at things like building block methodology. And we came up with something called the Savannah process, which is very similar. It's a comprehensive environmental flow method. And this is just sort of a cartoon version of some of what's going on ecologically. Again, in the water year in the United States, from October 1st through the end of September, you can kind of see natural patterns of flow and modified flow. And I'm not going to take time to get into this in detail, but just know that there was consideration of fish, of these bald cypress trees and their life cycles, and even far-ranging migratory bird species that rely on the health of the system. So we brought in the river ecology, the floodplain ecology, and the estuarine ecology, and we, in a 3-day workshop with 60 scientists, came out with a single unified environmental flow recommendation that everybody agreed to, which was exhausting, but it worked, and it was very exciting. So there's a lot of different ways to capture what the environmental flow recommendations entail. This is just one of them, but we sort of divided it into these flow categories: low flow, high flow, pulse, and flood flows, recognizing that ecologically there are things that each one of these kinds of flow characteristics provide and support. And then we also gave consideration to climatically dry, average, and wet years as part of the flow recommendations. And of course the temporal aspect, so this is again a calendar year, January to December. So as one example, I'll kind of blow up this box, maybe it'll be a little bit easier to see. So this middle box under this high flow pulse category had initially the articulation was the ecologist wanted to see a high flow pulse release coming out of J. Strom Thurman Dam that ranged somewhere between, these are of course in English terms, 20 to 40,000 cubic feet per second. Wanted to see that high flow pulse last for 2 to 3 days, and wanted there to be one per month from January through May. All right, so that's just, so this is just a simple sort of box articulation of that. And then below that, there's a sort of a justification, ecological set of ecological justifications for that. What are the ecological processes that this specific event is supposed to support? Which of course then feeds directly into the design of the monitoring that you want to do. All right, so we could evaluate, if we get these implemented, are we seeing these processes supported? And so we were able to, again, through this 3-day workshop, get these environmental flows articulated, and the Corps, within a couple of months, began implementing some of the components of flow. We sat down with the Corps right afterwards, the Savannah district, and they were able to look at the whole set of environmental flow components for the recommendations, and they were able to say, those we're kind of already doing. Those we know we can implement right away without any problem. These others we're not sure about. We're going to have to do some modeling on that. We're going to have to evaluate what the implications are for flood protection, for water supply, for hydropower generation, which is important in this system. So they needed to model those. And then there were others, another bucket, they looked at them and said, I don't see any time in the foreseeable future where we're ever going to be able to implement those. But still, it's good to know what those are. So again, here are some of the results that came out of it. One of the things that I personally like out of the process and that excited me most was this last one. So what happened was, through this process, there was established, that and it continues today, and this started in 2004, there was an established relationship between the water managers, the Corps engineers, the men and women who are actually operating the dam, and the scientists from these different agencies and organizations who have been conducting research and monitoring the condition of the Savannah River, the lower Savannah River system for years, some of them decades, and yet there hadn't been that kind of dialogue. Now there's ongoing dialogue and coordination. So if the Corps gets more water than they know what to do with and they need to release it, they can call the ecologists and they say, look, we have a certain amount of water, we need to release it within the next 2 or 3 weeks. How do you want us to release it? And they do everything that they possibly can, either to avoid adverse environmental impact or, in fact, to support some ecological processes. So that relationship, to me, is one of the most exciting things that's come out of this process, not just on the Savannah, but really at these river systems all across the U.S. So real quickly on the Bill Williams River, again, an extremely different river system. This is a small tributary on the lower Colorado River system. Colorado drains from the western Colorado and Wyoming down through the western United States and out into the Gulf of Mexico, which you don't really see here. But again, the Bill Williams is a tributary of the lower Colorado. It's again an extremely arid area. I just wanted to really show this picture. There's a number of things that have gone on. You see, this is Alamo Dam, which is the Corps' dam on the Bill Williams River. And it's during a controlled flood that was part of the environmental flows that we defined through the same process that I just described on the Savannah, that became known as the Savannah process. We applied that here. One of the components of the environmental flows for the Bill Williams River involved these flood events, which hadn't happened. And you can see it. This is the implementation of the controlled flood on the Bill Williams River, of one of the controlled flood releases, where the river is kind of busted out and it becomes this highly braided system. And there's so much ecologically that goes on here. There's willow cottonwood systems that require this kind of flood event. And here you see the scientists out monitoring the soil conditions and regeneration of willow cottonwood. It's also really important. These flood events help control non-native tamarisk, which have become invasive across the area. And there's also an unhealthy large population of beavers. So one of the things that the controlled flood hypothesized the controlled flood component would do was bust down some of these dams, because there was a shift in the lotic-lentic distribution, and it did. They figured out exactly at what threshold you started to see these dams start to fail. So that, just some examples of the kinds of monitoring that went on. It was so cool to see this happen across this really arid landscape. Quite impressive. So just a couple of other things. There are also some relationships that we started based on this experience. We were able to kind of go out and start interacting with other water managers. Frankly, it was very useful for the Nature Conservancy to be able to go into these conversations with the Corps of Engineers. We had tried to have a conversation, for example, with China Three Gorges Dam Corporation and other water managers in China. And rightly, they asked, well, what do you guys know about operating dams? You're a conservation organization. So we're able to, I'll come back to that in a second, but we're able to bring the Corps and say, well, they know a little bit about dam operations. Let's have some discussions around these ideas. But this is a different example. Rio Pituca in Honduras, where there was a planned dam. And this was kind of an interesting application of the Savannah process, where there was no scientific data, so we had to rely on traditional ecological knowledge. And there's a paper by Pete Esselman and Jeff Opperman that was published in 2004 that kind of captures how that knowledge, how that traditional ecological knowledge was sort of harvested and applied in developing some environmental flow recommendations for Rio Pituca. I mentioned the work with China Three Gorges Dam Corporation. It wasn't initially focused on Three Gorges Dam. It was focused on a cascade of dams upstream in the upper portion, middle portion of the Yangtze, upstream from the Sichuan Plateau. You can see some of the construction site here. I think they're actually done with the dams right now. But we had below that, and upstream of China Three Gorges Dam Reservoir, there's a native fish reserve that's, again, extensively rich in, ecologically speaking, and in fish in particular. And so the idea was to try to define environmental flows to help protect the native fish reserve. And that was, again, through a series of environmental flow workshops for that portion of the river. Maybe to kind of close out for the Sustainable Rivers program, I'm not going to go through all of these, or actually any of them. This is just kind of an articulation of maybe two things to get across here. One is that there are more sites now that have been added. There were originally 8. I think it's up now to 14. So originally there were 8 sites involving 36 core dams. There are now 14 to 16 sites with 60 to 65 core dams that are involved in the SRP. Some of the work is diversified, so it's gone beyond just these multi-purpose reservoirs to involve things like navigation lock-in dams and the operations of navigation lock-in dams to improve the environmental performance. The other thing that I wanted to note here, so if you want to look at the slide, this talks about the proposed work at each of these select sites in 2017. All right, so this is sort of proposed work at these sites, and it gives you a sense of the kind of work that continues on each of these locations. The other thing it indicates that you'll notice that this is, these shaded are the ones that were funded. So, right, everybody has the same problem, right? Much more demand than there is actual funding. So it is what it is. You do the best you can with the resources that you have. So with that, I will close, and I'd be happy to have, again, some discussion, questions, and again, would really love to hear about some of the work that you all are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.